Who had grandparents fight in WW2 and what stories did they share? My grandfather was in the resistance in Holland. He never spoke about the war to his wife, children or grandchildren. If asked to relate stories, he'd reply, "I will not be responsible for the nightmares of another," would turn his hearing aid off and nap in his chair. My Opa never spoke of the war either. He was sent to the work camps. He returned once somehow on foot, but was sent back. Oma didn't speak of the war, but right up to her death in 1990s, she would spit if she saw a German. My uncles only remembered the starvation, and that they mustn't talk. They were too young for anything else to stick. I don't think we can actually imagine, even though we've all watched movies and stuff. My Opa was captured right before the end of the war and was sent to a camp. He had a number on his forearm that none of us ever saw until after his death. In a photograph, he wore long sleeves, no matter the weather. No one knows why he wasn't gunned down on the spot. The camp was liberated a week or so after he got there. My Oma knew the gist of it but no details. They were married shortly after the war and I'm told she had no idea until later. He worked at a shipbuilding company and was often gone weeks at a time. We found out about most of these things from people his age after he died. Mind-boggling. My Austrian grandfather was drafted into the Wehrmacht and his unit was integrated into the SS in 1944. He was wounded in January 45 in the Battle of the Bulge whilst carrying out an attack on a US position. He got patched up by the Americans whilst the German officer wrote a letter home that he was missing in action. He still has the original letter. He was a prisoner of war in France from then on and had to stay until 46 or 47 as he was captured as a member of the SS and they were held longer than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. He still holds a grudge against the Nazis for stealing his youth and still has some shell or bullet fragments in his chest as far as I know. Cheers to the Americans for saving him. Really interesting since most of these replies are from Americans. Thanks for sharing. My granddad was Austrian too and had a similar fate. Although he was a POW in Russia for 2 years. He never told us grandkids any of it before he died. I gotta ask dad sometime if he remembers any stories. I'm not quite sure how much of it I'd want to know though. A lot of my friends' dads growing up were in Vietnam, and many of my dad's friends as well. And your last line about how much you want to know, let me just assure you I've heard some stories over the years that I wish I had never heard. Grandfather was in an amphibious division in the Pacific Theater. He left us with little snippets of his time. A camp was pitch black because they didn't want to be visible from above. A guy in his cabin went to the outhouse and sat down to do his business when he heard something. He pulled his lighter out and lit it. A python was dangling down staring him in the face. He and another man were walking on a beach and the other guy just got shot through the head from a sniper. That sniper's decision led to my existence. General MacArthur showed up and gave him a promotion along with a few others. They took a video of MacArthur shaking the hands of a line of soldiers and used it for a pro-American propaganda film to be played before movies in the US. My grandma saw it and freaked the F out, and the theater owners gave her a copy of the photo. None at all. My grandpa went to Europe as a teenager and it must have been messed up because he never talked about his experience all the way up to his death. He came back with 3 medals and nobody in the family knows what he did to get them. Grandfather was a US sniper in the Pacific. One of the best stories was of a cocky officer who showed up and lined all the infantry up on the beach to tell them they were a bunch of pansies and he was going to whip them into shape. These men had been seeing hand-to-hand combat for months. The officer finally said, "If there's a man on this beach that thinks he can whip my ass, take 1 step forward." Every man took a step forward immediately. The officer didn't say much after that. We had something like that happen after my first deployment. The whole company got together and we were able to call out anyone for a grappling match. One of our SSGs called out our company commander, who was possibly insane and was not entirely loved by the company. The co whipped the absolute shit out of the SSG lol. Well, that didn't go as planned. Ha ha ha. Both my grandfathers served in the US Army Air Force. One was a waist gunner on a B-17. He caught some shrapnel from a German AA Gun 1 mission and almost bled out on the return trip. While he was in the hospital his plane was shot down. The other was an MP who would tell us about busting heads in bars. My grandfather was a flight engineer / top turret gunner on the B-17. He was very tight-lipped about his service. I joined the army after he had passed, and my aunt gave me an album of pictures from his time in Europe. It was pretty eye-opening to his experiences. My paternal grandfather landed on Omaha on D-Day. That's it. That's all he ever shared. We know he spent the duration of the war in Europe, but whatever he saw or did was too much to ever tell my grandmother, dad, aunt or uncle. I think my granddad landed 2 or 3 days after D-Day and he never talked to me about it until a few months before his death. He recalled arriving on the beach and having to cross over the bodies of the fallen soldiers. It deeply affected him. Having him share just a few stories with me before he died this year felt like such an honor, as he never shared much with anyone about this time. My grandpa was in the army. He never spoke about his service, but he was shot in the ankle and captured. He spent years in a VA hospital once he returned to the States. I heard second-hand stories about the POW camp, specifically how the guards would smoke cigarettes and then intentionally flick the butts just out of reach of the prisoners inside the fence. He and his buddies devised a tool to reach out through the fence and grab the butts when the guard turned their back. They'd then pass the butt between them to get a tiny puff. He was a very kind, very quiet, very intelligent man who had a very bad drinking problem. My grandpa on my dad's side was 17 at the time and lied about his age to get into the Navy. He played saxophone in the Navy band aboard ships in the Pacific. I don't think he ever saw action, though, aside from that 6-axe action of course. My granddad was in WW2 in a tank destroyer unit. He never talked about it, but when I got back from a trip to Paris in high school he asked if it was still all blowed up over there, and said the last time he was there it was a big old mess. That's funny your granddad asked if it's still a mess. My grandpa used to give my dad shit because my dad got sent to Germany in '69. When my grandpa was there everything was bombed to shit. He would say my pops had it made because the base had roofs by the time my dad got there. In short, my grandpa was made prisoner, was sent to Germany for work, volunteered to work in a farm. He knew nothing about farming, but though food would be easier to come by, he didn't know German either. Became friends with a little girl there that was a bit older than his own kids. She started viewing him like an older brother. He attended her wedding. Once the war was over, she had a baby boy. He had a third, unplanned child too. Those became friends. Attended each other's weddings. Then they had kids. Me and one of the German kids decided to learn each other's language. Then we studied in each other's country for a year. Thanks, Erasmus program. I attended her wedding last year. We don't talk much anymore. I'm sorry to report. We are not that good at keeping in touch from afar, but rest assured we are trying. This is the most wholesome one I've seen yet. Didn't share until he got Alzheimer's. Didn't remember me and thought I was one of his Navy buddies. Then he reminisced about splitting the jaws of Japanese dead soldiers open to get their gold teeth. Said somewhere and all the way dead when he did it. War is hell. This is freaky. It's also not the first comment I've seen and hear about pulling the gold teeth out of dead Japanese soldiers. Grandfather trained in Canada with British officers before flying to Britain. Went to Italy, was almost killed when his jeep drove off a cliff to avoid capture by Nazis. Was taken back to Britain to heal. Looked up the family of an officer he knew. Officer's sister became my grandmother. Did they live in Britain or come back to Canada? Canada. Edit. Another story was she came through Pier 21 in Halifax for immigration. And her standing on a tall staircase in a long line. Nervous after her journey. Then happy to see my grandfather who was underneath waiting for her. When my grandmother died, we helped my grandfather move out of his house into an apartment. I had found a mason jar filled with old shiny rocks in his basement. When we looked closer, we realized it was gold teeth, aka kills from the war. That's when I learned my grandfather was a sniper. He served on the Pacific side fighting the Japanese. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 99. Well into his 90s though. He could still shoot a squirrel with a gun and a slingshot from a pretty long distance. He met up with the men in his unit every year after the war, until they all died. My grandfather's friend has a story about a guy who said he was deaf so that he wouldn't go to the war. The guy choosing the people tossed a coin on the floor beside him, and he immediately searched for it. He was sent to the war. My grandfather enlisted when he was 14, served in India for some years, but got shot by a sniper and was shipped back to UK. How does a 14Y/O pass for an 18Y/O? Or is there something here I'm missing? The army sometimes didn't ask many questions when in the middle of a world war. There was a bombing and a friend of my grandfather was hiding under the table, but it collapsed on him, leaving him with a brain injury that would give him flashbacks from time to time where he again thought bombers are coming. To not get hit again, he always started to run out of the building he was in. Once he jumped out of the second floor of a building because of it, and that was it for him. Damn, that's sad. Both granddads in the Navy. Great aunt survived a concentration camp. No one says anything, ever. WW2 was like Fight Club, apparently. Would you wanna relive it? In an odd way, there wasn't the animosity toward the average German soldier that today's soldiers would have against ISIS fighters, for example, either. They knew those were guys that had been hauled away from home and slung into it just like them, and had to kill and avoid being killed by them anyway. No one should want to relive it, but it is important to document as many of their stories as possible so people don't forget. I mean shit. There are Holocaust survivors still living, while there are people who think the Holocaust never happened. Can you imagine that happening after what you went through? My grandpa was in the Navy and was a rear gunner on a plane. He was still training when the war was finishing up, but the story goes that he was trying to shoot a target on the ground for training. He was adamant on hitting it, so he unbuckled himself to get a better shot. Because of this, he got pulled out of the plane and was hanging on only by the rear gun. Eventually he was able to pull himself back into the plane surprisingly. He probably never tried that again. Was your grandfather Nathan Drake? Edit. Damn. First silver. Thanks, stranger. My maternal grandfather, Canada, RGC, was about to get on the boat for the deep raid and got pulled off at the last minute and put into intelligence. The guy that replaced him didn't make it. He spent a bunch of the war doing photo analysis and helped with the man that never was. Also, there's a famous story where Jen Patton, US, was to be told to wait for Jen Montgomery, UK, before entering Germany. Apparently, Gramps was the poor young officer who got to tell him. Dean. My grandfather lied about his age and joined the Marines. Went to Iwo Jima and got his thumb shot off. Came home and rode shotgun for Wells Fargo armored trucks. My grandpa lied about his age to join the Marines, too. And family legend had it that he was a handful of men from being sent to Okinawa or something. He ended up in China, where he didn't have anything to do but jump ditches in his Jeep. But hey, he came home and had a family, so how's that for his boring deployment? My one grandfather refused to ever talk about the war with anyone. Both of mine actually served in World War II, but I never heard any stories. Same here. Mom's side served in Japan. Dad's side in Europe. I know that my dad's father was a Parisian and a figure in the French resistance, but he refused to ever discuss what he actually did. My grandma would say that he kept everything bottled up because for years it meant life or death for him to keep his mouth shut. I think it was just so horrible that a lot of people didn't ever want to talk about it. I can't say I blame them. Hey PSSST, please subscribe and like.